So I know you said that in your bio that, you began writing fan fiction.
Hmm.
And so I guess my first question is this story rooted from some fan fiction? Or like, is it, inspired by the movie or other Titanic stories that you've read?
It actually was inspired by the movie. I was writing one of my contemporary romances, and one of the characters, her favorite movie is Titanic, and I had not seen Titanic in over 10 years, or I mean, it had been a long time. And then I so I had to rewatch the movie. I was like, if I want to write jokes about this, I need to rewatch it, familiarize myself,
Yeah.
and I absolutely fell in love with it, and it just like awakened this whole thing. And then plus, it was also like around the time the whole Titan submersible thing was happening. So people were
Mm,
talking about Titanic. It just
yeah.
was kind of this perfect storm of things that happened for me to get into the Titanic and the history of it. And so
Mhm.
the movie was a huge like motivator. I wanted to tell a very different story from what we see in the movie. I didn't want it to feel like fan fiction of the movie, even though fan fiction from the movie is very fun. I think it's
Yeah.
great, but the I definitely wanted this to be an original story about two very different people in very different positions on the ship, so that it would not feel too much like Titanic fan fiction. So this actually came from writing another story and then watching the movie and being like, oh my gosh, I want to write my own version of
Yeah.
this, I guess. And I do have other historical based fan fictions that I want to adapt into original work. I have two actually Band of Brothers fan fictions that at some point I want to adapt into historical romances of their own. So yeah, I this one didn't start that way, but I've got some others
Yeah,
on
yeah.
deck.
Well, and I'm curious, I've actually never read fan fiction. I have this impression that fan fiction is very romance driven in general, if I'm going to
Hmm.
categorize sweeping. So I'm curious, from writing fan fiction to writing romance, commercial romance, what's your take? Are they similar? Is it a different approach that you have to do when you're writing commercial romance?
Yeah, the main difference is that when you go into fan fiction, it the world has already been established for what you're writing. Like everyone going into and reading that fan fiction knows who the surrounding characters are and knows the world that they're jumping into. So you don't have to do like any world building or really
Mm,
sort of a lot of the groundwork that you have to do when you're writing original stuff, especially if it's like fantasy or whatever. But even in things like contemporary fiction or whatever, and or even just your average TV show that takes place in the world we live in, you still don't have to establish who's who. And with original work, you do. You have to explain who everyone is in regards to
yeah.
the story. So it's a little bit more groundwork as far as original fiction goes. But for me, almost all the fan fiction I was reading and writing was extremely romance driven. It was a lot of like original characters that people would put in and have them have a love story with whoever their crush on the show was, so or in the book was. So at least that was the case for me. That was what I did, and a lot of what other writers that I read, it was what they were doing. So it was kind of like already writing romance novels. We were just inserting a romance novel into this thing that already existed. So for me, there it wasn't too difficult of a crossover. It was just adapting to having an entirely original cast. And obviously with Ship of Dreams, I didn't have as much of that problem because people were familiar with the Titanic and they know who some of those historical figures are, especially if they were Titanic kids at one point. But
Yeah.
yeah, the transition from fan fiction to original romance stuff happened pretty smoothly because I felt like I already had the structure of I'm writing this character, falling in love with this character.
Yeah, the blueprint was there.
Yeah.